by way of introduction, I want to just sort of tell the story of how this panel happened. It arose out of almost a throwaway comment that Jason made on an episode of the pod where he was talking about, lining up speakers for this event. And he said that, he was having a hard time getting liberals and all he could find were like right wingers like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi. And in terms of just to explain their backgrounds a little bit, Matt was sort of like the left-wing firebrand, sort of populist firebrand on writing for Rolling Stone, who back in 2009 was asking the question why the people who caused the great financial crisis, why no one was going to jail. And Glenn, broke this Snowden story about how the government was engaging in mass surveillance on all of us and raising questions about the infringement of our civil liberties. So, both these guys have, I'd say, well-established bona fides, used to be considered left-wing sort of liberal bona fides, but now today somehow they've been read out of what you would call liberalism today. And so that comment that Jason made I think there's so much to unpack there on how that happened. What does liberalism today mean if it doesn't include you guys?
In one way, it's natural that political alliances shift as different issues go to the fore and alliances change as a result. But I think something much more important is that liberalism itself has changed largely by virtue of Donald Trump, because liberals as a defining view, maybe as an overarching view.
Maybe Democrats, not liberals.
Yeah, by liberals, I just mean kind of the mainstream wing of the Democratic Party, the way Hillary Clinton calls herself progressive. So again, illustrating the bankruptcy of these terms. But by liberals, I just mean kind of like the Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer wing, have come to believe that the overarching way to understand politics is that there's one primary menace and risk to the United States, which is Donald Trump, his movement, and the Republican Party. And it's not just that they have a bad ideology, but that they're actual fascists trying to instill a white nationalist dictatorship. And if you actually believe that, if that's something that you genuinely believe, on some level it becomes rational to start embracing authoritarian methods of resisting that, of combating that, censoring, using due process-free processes to punish people and deprive them of their liberty. And I think anytime a political movement gets convinced that it is no longer involved in a political debate, but a historic war between pure good and pure evil, it starts to turn to authoritarian tactics to win because it believes that's justified or even necessary. And those authoritarian tactics happen to be the ones that the left traditionally had opposed and now are embracing. And I guess Matt and I didn't decide that we were going to change our views of the last 30 years about these issues. And that has caused this organic breach, not just between us two, but others like us. And as I said, anyone who finds themselves outside of liberal orthodoxy automatically receives the far right label.
And one of the themes that came out of that reporting was that in the sort of post-bailout economy, the wealth gap was widening. And I just read a statistic that said that during the Obama years, the bottom 99% saw their average wealth decrease by $4,900, whereas the top 1% saw its wealth increase by an average of $4.9 million. And so, I didn't make that big of a deal of this in my reporting, but when 2016 came around, in covering both the Trump and Sanders campaigns, it was abundantly clear that this widening wealth gap and the stress that it had placed on populations on both the left and the right was a significant factor in this race. And when I started to write this in the context of covering Trump, rather than just doing the usual thing of tossing off insults about the candidate, which is easy enough to do with Trump, I started to say things like, well, there are reasons why he's succeeding. He's attracting crowds that are not just the usual Republican crowds. There are former union members here. They have a lot in common with the crowds who show up at Bernie Sanders events. And I started to notice a distinctly unpleasant reaction from people inside the business, where it quickly became taboo to explain Donald Trump in any way other than this is a white supremacist movement and he's appealing to, the lowest common denominator through that kind of messaging. Now, I happen to believe that was certainly part of what was going on, but it wasn't the whole explanation. But I think Trump is the dividing line of what you're talking about. If you have a nuanced explanation for Donald Trump, then you can't be part of the club anymore.
Trump saved them all. He saved the entire industry. They all owed their jobs, their second homes, the ability to pay off their IRS debt to Donald Trump, because you can trace his emergence on the scene to when people started watching those programs again. And what they did was they rebranded as the resistance to Donald Trump. And they sacrificed any even pretense of journalistic function. They know, and you just look at polling data, that 95% of the people who watch MSNBC and 93% of the people who read the New York Times and trust it identify as Democrats. So there's a completely polarized media. One of the kind of non-media examples is the ACLU. There was an article in 2015 in the ACLU about the ACLU in the Washington Post that they were had to engage in mass layoffs of their staff because they had no money. Trump gets inaugurated, they start tweeting, every day, we'll see you in court, Mr. Trump, and stimulating the, kind of G zones of every liberal. And suddenly they're drowning in money, millions and millions of dollars, building, the ACLU, it's always financially struggled. And as a result, they're completely captive now to that kind of an audience. I have a friend, I guess I had a friend, who was a host of an MSNBC show, and they once told me that they don't get show-by-show ratings, they get segment-by-segment ratings. And ever since Trump, they told me the minute you put on anybody who's critical of the Democratic Party anyway, you can just see the audience completely disappear, which you can imagine a person in that position, what an enforcement mechanism that is, to know that they have a salary and kids and the need to pay for college and their mortgage. And they know if they do anything that deviates at all from Democratic Party doctrine, they're going to lose their audience. The New York Times knows that. The ACLU knows that. And so, yeah, I think it's not just that they've lost their credibility and can't get it back, which is absolutely true, as Matt said. It's also that they're now captive to this kind of prison cell that they built for themselves, chasing the sugar high that Trump provided. There are increasing numbers of non-white voters all over the country moving to the Republican Party under Trump and voting increasingly for Trump. You had a larger share of black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters than any Republican candidate in decades, and those trends are only worsening. And so you have this media that has no interest in and no ability to understand how the majority of people in the United States live, because their lives are completely separate, lived in these isolated enclaves. And the more you kind of immerse yourself in in a set of institutional beliefs and a kind of ethos of your enclave, just constantly hearing a belief reinforced and reinforced, the more you believe it, the more you're immersed in it, the more immune you become to facts that negate it. And so that's the reason why the media is so incurious, because they've embraced this narrative that the only reason anyone would vote for Republicans, the only reason anyone would vote for Trump is because they're racist or they're fascist or they're white supremacists. And it's left them completely unable to grapple with things like 10 million people voting twice for Obama and then for Trump, or the fact, as Matt alluded to, there were all kinds of people in 2016 who, if you asked them, they would say, yeah, I have 2 favorite candidates this year. And you'd say, who are they? And they would say, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. To a working journalist, most working journalists or pundits or political operatives, that makes no sense. They can't comprehend that because they see the world through this traditional left-right prism that for increasing sections of the country, I would argue a majority, is no longer applicable, is no longer how they see the world. And this is so dangerous when you have this radical breach between the opinion-making journalistic class and elite class on the one hand, and most of the population on the other. They just live completely different lives, work with a completely set of beliefs about the world, have completely different sets of interests. And if you look at countries throughout history where that has happened, where there's been this complete divergence between the people who hold power in the country and the rest of the country over whom they exercise that power, instability at best, and usually much worse things inevitably arise.
One of the big stories that went uncovered and continues to go uncovered is the transformation of the Democratic electorate. The last time I looked at this, 41 of the richest 50 congressional districts in America had Democrats in those seats, and all of the top 10 richest districts were won by Democrats. Whereas as recently as 1992, the split was more like 50-50. If you live in an affluent suburb, the overwhelming majority of the voters there are going to be Democrats now. And the big divide in American politics is no longer about ideology, it's significantly about income and even more education. This is another taboo subject. Nobody likes to talk about this because it speaks to a transformation that happened in the Democratic Party that began, I think, with Clinton, when they went away from relying on unions for financial support. The DLC's big strategic idea was, let's be more competitive on the fundraising front by being more pro-business or pro-growth. That was the term that they used a lot. And a couple of decades later, what you end up with is a party that no longer has any real organic connection to working people of any kind. That's a massive factor in all of this, is that the reporting on class politics has become taboo. All you have to do is go to a Donald Trump event and you can see it clearly, that the composition of the crowds is vastly different from what you see at a Democratic event. And that's one of the reasons why they hated the media, because they saw us as upper class representatives of the coastal elite who all live in New York, LA, and Washington, which is true for the most part. And it got increasingly hostile as time went on, and that's why Trump was scoring so many points going after us, because we were symbols of the upper class. And that's another reason why I think the divide is no longer neatly between left and right anymore. It has a lot more to do with class than it ever did before.
There has been a radical change in the composition of the Republican Party ideologically because of Trump, not because Trump is some sort of disciplined political theorist or deep thinker, but because he ushered in, as David was saying earlier, he ran in 2016 in opposition to Bush-Cheney foreign policy, in opposition to Reagan economics. He railed against the power of large corporations at the expense of the working person, something you never would have heard from Reagan. But he also ushered in a lot of hostility toward agencies like the CIA and the NSA and the FBI,
NATO.
Something that had always been the province of the left. And so now you have an enormous amount of space opened on the right for all kinds of views that had previously been closed. And I think there's just a lot more vibrancy on the right, a lot more internal debate, whereas in the Democratic Party, it's just a very much you're either with us or you're against us mindset, and any deviation, as we were talking about at the beginning, automatically results in them proclaiming you their enemy, which doesn't seem like a very effective way of doing politics to me. You know, I think probably the worst media myth is that the two parties can never get along, there's no more bipartisanship, they're so radically different, they can't agree on anything, when the reality is they agree on most things. It's just that the only things we hear about are the times when they disagree, but overwhelmingly on foreign policy, on economic policy, Obama himself said the two parties are essentially playing within the 40-yard line. So the entire rest of the playing field is basically not part of the political process because they have the same fundamental beliefs. And I think one of the reasons why Trump was such a shock to the system was not because the Trump administration itself was a deviation from the American political tradition. It wasn't, but because some of the things he said, like questioning NATO and whether it has viability, was designed to undermine that bipartisan consensus. But I think in general, you're right, that the establishment wings of both parties are far more in agreement with one another than they are different. And I think you're also right that as long as those two wings of each party continue to trade power, the ruling class in the United States is very happy.